Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and today we are having a look at possibly the most famous combat knife in military history. This is a Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife, also known as a Fairbairn-Sykes commando dagger. And as the name suggests, this is a knife very closely associated with the British Commandos of World War II. Now, the Commandos were formed on the instructions of Prime Minister Winston Churchill on June 6, 1940, shortly after the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from the beaches of Dunkirk. Now, since the BEF was forced to leave most of its weapons and equipment behind in France, it really wasn't in a position to carry out any significant offensive action against Nazi Germany. Indeed, the only branch of the British Armed Forces that could at that time was the Royal Air Force. Still, the army wanted a more active role than simply defending Britain against invasion by the Germans, and so the commandos were formed, and they were named after the highly mobile units of settlers encountered by the British in the 1899 to 1902 Boer War. And so the commandos were made up of small units of highly trained men who could carry out nuisance raids against occupied Europe, either by seaborne landing or parachute drop. And in the early days, they were equipped with rather a hodgepodge of weapons, and this went for their melee weapons as well as their firearms. So a lot of early commandos were equipped with civilian hunting knives, such as the Wilkinson RBD, or a variety of trench knives left over from First World War stock. On November 4th, 1940, however, about 2 months after the commandos were officially formed, a meeting took place in Pall Mall between the directors of the Wilkinson Sword Company and two very interesting hand-to-hand combat consultants. So Wilkinson's sword was founded in 1775 by one Henry Knock, who those of you who watch Forgotten Weapons might recognize as the namesake of the Knock gun, a type of multi-barreled firearm developed at the end of the 18th century. And they had a reputation for producing very high-quality custom knives for hunters and adventurers. And one of their most famous products was the Wilkinson Shakespeare knife, which was created in 1860 at the request of one Captain Henry Shakespeare, who was a very famous big game hunter in India. And this was based on the Indian shikar knife and was intended for close-range defense against dangerous game. So say if a tiger is charging at you and you expend all of your ammunition trying to take it down and it's still coming, you can pull this rather big knife out of your jacket and hopefully take it out at close range. Now, the two consultants that met with Wilkinson's sword on November 4th are even more interesting. They were William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes. And their stories are absolutely fascinating and a little bit beyond the scope of this video. But in brief, William Fairbairn was born in 1885. He joined the Royal Marines in 1901 and served in the Far East. And in 1907, he quit the Marines and joined up as a constable for the Shanghai Municipal Police. Now, at this time, Shanghai, along with large sections of China, were administered by various Western colonial powers, including France, Great Britain, Germany, the United States, and Japan. And this was due to treaties signed in the wake of these countries' intervention in the 1900 Boxer Uprising. And so Shanghai became a very cosmopolitan city of commerce. It was also a very lawless city, especially as China passed into its revolutionary and warlord periods in the 1910s and 1920s. And there were tons of revolutionaries, corrupt warlords, organized criminals running around and terrorizing the population. So it was a very dangerous place to be a policeman. And indeed, as Fairbairn rose through the ranks, he found that officers were being disproportionately killed in the line of duty by these various criminal elements. Fairbairn himself was actually cornered in the red light district by members of the Tong Gang and mercilessly beaten and stabbed and left for dead. Of course, he survived, but in the wake of this incident, he A, learned jiu-jitsu, and B, started looking more at the training that his fellow officers were receiving. And what he found was that the training was totally inadequate for the realities of street fighting in the field. So, for example, officers were trained in classical shooting techniques. They were trained to fully draw and carefully aim their weapons before shooting. And of course, in the time it took for them to do that, their opponent would already have shot or stabbed them. And so when Fairbairn took over training of the Shanghai Municipal Police in the 1920s, he instituted a point shooting technique where you draw very quickly, fire 2 shots from the hip, and then carefully aim and fire a 3rd shot. And the idea behind this is that at best, you will hit your opponent and take him down, and at worst, you will impede him, you will stop him for a couple of seconds, giving you the time necessary to take a carefully aimed shot. He also instructed that the safeties on all of the police's weapons be disabled, because he found that statistically speaking, a safety was more likely to get you killed than save you from an accident. And in addition to this, he developed a whole doctrine of close-in fighting for bare hands, knives, and firearms, and authored a number of influential books, including Defendu, Scientific Self-Defense in 1926, and Shoot to Live in 1942, along with Eric Sykes, who was also an inspector with the Shanghai Municipal Police at the same time as Fairbairn. So when the Second World War began, Fairbairn and Sykes left Shanghai for Britain, and there became very influential consultants for the newly formed British Special Forces. And during this meeting on November 4th, 1940, with Wilkinson Sword, they laid out their specifications for the ideal commando fighting knife. And this was based off a knife they had already developed in Shanghai called the Shanghai knife, early versions of which were modified from 1888 Lee Metford rifle bayonets. And there's actually a drawing that survives from this meeting that shows the basic design that they were going for. So the first of these requirements was that the blade be as thin as possible. And this is because the main function of this knife was envisioned to be the elimination of sentries. So you would come up behind the sentry, clap your hand over his mouth to stop him from crying out, and then slip your knife between his ribs into his heart to kill him instantly. And ideally, this was a procedure that would be done with 2 people. The other person's job would be to grab the sentry's firearm as he dropped it so that it wouldn't clatter to the ground and alert others. And at the same time, of course, the blade had to be as strong as possible so that it didn't break when you tried to pull it out. Another requirement was that the blade be as sharp as possible. And this was not only so that it could punch through heavy woolen clothing, webbing, and other equipment that your target might be wearing, but also, in Fairbairn's own words, in close quarters fighting, there is no more deadly weapon than the knife. In choosing a knife, there are 2 important factors to bear in mind: balance and keenness. The hilt should fit easily in your hand, and the blade should not be so heavy that it tends to drag the hilt from your fingers in a loose grip. It is essential that the blade have a sharp stabbing point and good cutting edges, because an artery torn through, as against a clean cut, tends to contract and stop the bleeding. If a main artery is cleanly severed, the wounded man will quickly lose consciousness and die. Now, speaking of balance, Fairbairn and Sykes actually specified a particular balance point for the knife, which in the current NATO specification is 1 1/32 inches from the rear of the crossguard, plus or minus 1/16 of an inch. And certain sources will state that this was so that the knife could be more easily thrown, though this was neither an intended nor an authorized use of the knife. Rather, that particular balance was specified so that you could actually toss the knife from one hand to another, whichever was most convenient in that particular situation, without taking your eyes off your target. And since this knife was intended not only for taking out sentries from behind, but also direct hand-to-hand fighting, it had to be sharpened on both sides so that it didn't matter what orientation you held it in. So following this meeting, Charles Rose, the head of Wilkinson's experimental workshop, converted these specifications into what would become known as the first pattern Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife. And one of its most distinctive features is the flat section or ricochet at the rear of the blade, just forward of the crossguard. And this featured a little etching panel that bore the name of the company, Wilkinson Sword, as well as the name of the knife, FS Fighting Knife. These first patterns also had a distinctive S-shaped crossguard, as well as a solid machined brass handle with diagonal knurling. And all of these were manufactured without any finish on the blade, and they were issued with a leather scabbard with a brass chase or end cap to prevent the blade from breaking out through the leather, a small strap with a snap button to hold the handle in place, and 4 fabric tabs, and these were intended to be sewed securely to a commando's clothing or web gear. Now, on November 14th, 1940, just 10 days after this meeting between Wilkinson, Fairbairn, and Sykes, the Ministry of Supply placed an initial order for 1,500 first pattern Fairbairn-Sykes knives, which, interestingly enough, they designated as hunting knives in order to hide their true purpose. And all of these were handmade by Wilkinson, meaning that there are slight variations in fit and finish between all of them, and they were delivered at a rate of around 1,000 per week. And these were reportedly very well received by the commandos and took part in some of the earliest commando raids of the war. However, by August 1941, demand for these knives had risen to such a degree that Wilkinson updated the design to make it much easier to mass produce. So one of the first things they did was to eliminate the ricochet at the rear of the blade so that the blade could be more easily manufactured using automated machinery. However, they did have to machine a small triangular flat at the very rear of the blade to allow the tang to pass through the crossguard. Now, the crossguard itself was also modified from its original S shape to a much easier to manufacture flat profile. But perhaps the most significant change to the design of the second pattern Fairbairn-Sykes was to the handle. As I said, the first pattern handles were machined from solid brass rod. But brass was a highly strategic material and very tightly controlled, and so for the second pattern, they switched to cast brass so that they could include a large void inside the handle and save brass. Now, on an individual knife, this amounted to only a couple of ounces of brass, but multiplied over the tens of thousands of knives that they needed to manufacture, this amounted to a great savings in brass consumption. Now, another change made to the second pattern Fairbairn-Sykes was to the scabbard. So the brass chape at the end was changed from a more rounded button profile to a flat-ended profile, and later a tapered profile, and the snap strap at the top was replaced with an elastic band. And while the first few batches of these knives were delivered with bright blades, starting in September 1942, they were given a darkened finish to increase concealability at night. And in October 1942, the Ministry of Supply placed an order for 38,000 blackened second pattern Fairbairn-Sykes knives. Now, the vast majority of these second pattern knives were manufactured by Wilkinson, though it is known that the drawings made up by Wilkinson were actually given by the Ministry of Supply to John Clark and Sons of Sheffield, though it's unclear how many of the knives they themselves produced. So the third and final major update to the design took place in October 1943, producing the third pattern Fairbairn-Sykes. And there are two main distinguishing features of this pattern. Number one, there is no triangular flat at the rear of the blade. And number two, and more significantly, is the change in the handle design. So by this time, Wilkinson moved away from using brass towards a less strategically vital alloy, and from using a machined knurled pattern to this new handle design with 27 stacked rings. And this meant that the handle could be cast in one operation and used immediately with almost no remedial machining operations. And at the same time, manufacture of the handle started being outsourced to other firms, specifically 4 different die casting companies: Wolverhampton Die Casting Company, Walsall Die Casting Limited, Perry Bar Metal Company, and H.J. Mabry. And which company manufactured a particular handle was indicated by a numbered stamp on the handle itself, 1 to 4. But aside from Wolverhampton, which was stamp number 4, which number is associated with which company has been lost to history. And if you are a collector of these knives, the general rule of thumb is that unless it's a fake or a reproduction, if it has a stamp, it was manufactured during the war. If it doesn't, it is of post-war manufacture. And the third pattern, Fairbairn-Sykes, was the most widely produced, and indeed is the pattern still produced today for various militaries around the world. And this example that we have right here is a third pattern. You can see that it has the rings on the handle as well as no ricochet on the blade. I don't actually know the particular provenance of this knife. I'm borrowing it from a friend, but I would hazard a guess that because of the good quality of the elastic strap on it, that it is a modern reproduction. Typically, rubber from that era tends to degrade fairly quickly. And as you can see, this has been etched as a commemorative knife for the Princess Louise's Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, with the name of the unit etched on one side, and the motto Alga Gubre, or Scotland Forever, on the other side. And I apologize to my Gaelic viewers if I completely butchered that. So during the war, the Fairbairn-Sykes was issued to a number of different units, not only the Commandos, but also the Special Air Service and certain units of the British Paras, as well as the American Rangers and Marine Raiders. and the design inspired a number of similar knives used by other services. So, for example, the American Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the precursor to the CIA, developed its own OSS stiletto, which was very similar to the Fairbairn-Sykes, except for its scabbard, whose ridiculously large belt frog earned it the nickname the Pancake Flipper. Similarly, the American-Canadian Special Service Force, also known as the Devil's Brigade, developed its own version called the V-42 Stiletto. And post-war, the Fairbairn-Sykes was sold to the militaries of a number of foreign nations, including Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, the Netherlands, Norway, France, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Spain. And in 1982, a special rush order of 250 knives was manufactured for use by British Special Forces during the Falklands War. And the Fairbairn-Sykes is still in the official NATO inventory with the stock number of 1095-99-963-2037. Now, as you can imagine, given the iconic status of this knife, there are tons of fakes floating about. And while that's well beyond the scope of this video, I will link in the description in my sources to a site dedicated to the Fairbairn-Sykes knife. It includes a page of all the little details that you have to be careful of if you're trying to collect these so that you don't end up buying a modern fake. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on another video where we'll look at yet more knives, weapons, and other fascinating devices just like this one. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.